Hey everybody, this is John the Other, obviously. So, among the one or two things I've said which have got people a little worked up was a remark I made about a week ago in which I said evolutionary psychology, or Evo-Psych, as is practiced by armchair theoreticians, is pseudo-scientific bullcrap. And obviously a few people got a little excited about that opinion of mine, particularly people who have repeatedly used Evo-Psych as a prop to provide an authoritative sounding basis for their own preferences or prejudices. But before we get into any of that, it's worth exploring a little bit about what the phrase evolutionary psychology refers to, just what that field of study actually is, before we even try to determine whether it's a respectable academic endeavor, whether it belongs to the camp of social science, or it should be classified as a hard scientific discipline, or is it just a pop psychology fad? The Evo-Psych entry on Rational Wiki begins with the following paragraph. Evolutionary Psychology, EP, attempts to explain how and why complex human behaviors emerged as a result of evolution of the humans and the human brain. This includes fitness advantages that such behavior gives, i.e., by natural selection. In the broadest sense, behaviors or social constructs are seen as adaptations in the same way as physical adaptations. That's the end of the quote. Now that opening provides a relatively good definition of what Evo-Psych is, but even on Rational Wiki we can see bias creeping in with the mention of social constructs. The explanation provided for what Evo-Psych is lists social constructs as a thing explained through evolutionary psychology as a product of evolution. But so-called social constructs are not an observed phenomenon to be explained by the hypotheses of the field of Evo-Psych or any other field. Rather, the term social construct is another hypothesis or theory, posited as an explanation for complex behavior. It is a formal logical fallacy called begging the question to use that term, social construct, in that explanation because it assumes its own conclusion. Now, the reason I'm being so nitpicky here is that in the debate about, 1, whether Evo-Psych is a scientific discipline, and 2, whether in its amateur armchair commentary version it becomes a baloney pseudo-science, it's very important to distinguish between something that is observed as a phenomenon, like complex behavior, and something that is suggested as an explanation for that observed phenomenon, such as this is a socially constructed behavior learned through experience of an individual and interactions with other people, or, alternately, this is an inherited behavior which developed through natural selection. So evolutionary psychology is a field of study attempting to explain elements of complex behavior as inherited patterns pre-programmed into our brains and developed by our ancient ancestors through natural selection. The attraction to Evo-Psych is obvious. We like what we like not because of our own individualistic or idiosyncratic choices. No, we like flat green lawns or slender, leggy blondes and whatever social dynamic suits us because it was reproductively advantageous to our ancient ancestors. Your opinion isn't just some fickle choice, it's science. So there's a nice blast of dopamine for your brain, right? At least if you believe in Evo-Psych. Well, maybe. But we're asking two questions here. The first is whether Evo-Psych is a scientific discipline, and the second question, which to some degree depends on the first for an answer, whether even if it is a respectable scientific discipline, it is only wishful thinking and pseudo-scientific jargon serving to justify the confirmation bias of people with strong opinions and seeking an authoritative sounding prop to lend themselves credibility and squash differing opinion when espoused from your sofa in front of a YouTube connected camera. So we begin with that first question. Is evolutionary psychology a respectable scientific discipline? A casual reading of Steven Pinker is not sufficient to answer this. Hank Campbell, writing for Science2.0.com, describes one of the problems with current evolutionary psychology as follows. I'm quoting him here. He says, Evolutionary psychologists insist they are using the same rigor as biologists and just want to explain the brain. But what they are really doing is rationalizing cultural positions and hoping to map that to a biological topology. Dr. Michael Price, PhD, lecturer in the psychology department at Brunel University, West London, and co-director for the Center of Culture and Evolutionary Psychology, wrote an entire article on Psychology Today discussing that there should be no confusion that the brain has evolved or adapted. Yet this is a sort of straw man, because I can't find anyone. I'm still reading Hank Campbell here, so this is Hank saying, I can't find anyone who contends the brain did not adapt. What evolutionary psychology contends instead is that social constructs are biological. Hank Campbell continues to say, if I like girls with blonde hair, women evolved to have blonde hair, and that means that with the advent of Miss Clairol, actual blondes may die out. I'm still reading from Hank Campbell, writing at Science 2.0. He says, I am not trying to pick on Dr. Price. His article is pretty middle of the road in its claims, and it is well written, although maybe a little heavy on the neuroscience envy side. I am completely convinced, he is convinced, that evolutionary psychology can't be wrong, but what evolutionary psychology needs is the same kind of internal accountability that biology and physics have. If you want to claim in evolutionary biology or organic chemistry that life started in arsenic, then you'd better have rigorous data. But if you want to claim that the brain evolved to solve problems, no one in evolutionary psychology even blinks at you. That's the end of the quote. I'll put a link to that in the low bar. But Evo-Psych does make some foundational claims which require evidence to either support or disprove them. And one of them is that complex behaviors exist as pre-programmed and biologically inherited behavior modules which evolved in early humans. But functionally, this model poses a problem. In parsing all of the informational input that a human receives and then responding to that information with one or more behavioral modules, there must be a mechanism of evaluation and selection of which programmed behavior to enact based on the situation at hand. So to overcome this logical problem, Evo-Psych adherents are stuck with the idea that a homunculus, or a little man, exists within the mind to process information and then activate whatever Evo-Psych behavioral modules are appropriate based on the circumstance. Pinker wrote the following, starting on page 79 of his book, How the Mind Works. He said, the intelligence of the system emerges from the activities of the not-so-intelligent mechanical demons inside it. The point made first by Jerry Fodor in 1968 has been succinctly put by Daniel Dennett. And now he's quoting, this is Pinker quoting Dennett in his book. He says, homunculi are bogeymen only if they duplicate entire the talents that they are rung in to explain. If one can get a team or a committee of relatively ignorant, narrow-minded, and blind homunculi to produce the intelligent behavior of the whole, then that is progress. A flowchart is typical, the organizational chart of a committee of homunculi, investigators, librarians, accountants, executives, and so on. Each box specifies a homunculi by prescribing a function without saying how it is accomplished. One says, in effect, put a little man in here to do the job. If we then look closer at the individual boxes, we see that the function of each is accomplished by subdividing it via another flowchart into still smaller and more stupid homunculi. Eventually, this nesting of boxes within boxes lands you with homunculi so stupid that all they have to do is remember whether to say yes or no when asked, and they can be, as one says, replaced by a machine. One discharges fancy and complex homunculi from one scheme by organizing armies of idiot homunculi to do the work. This is all a quote from Steven Pinker in How the Mind Works, starting on page 79, although Pinker is largely quoting Daniel Dennett. That's Pinker's quote from How the Mind Works, and although it might seem obvious, I'm not going to offer a layman's or my common sense opinion of this homunculus hypothesis. It is sufficient to recognize that the rest of the scientific community is not satisfied that these ideas conform to necessary testability or disprovability of an idea that must be possible for scientific hypothesis and credibility. Dan Dennett's reduction to the absurd of an ever-diminishing in intellect series of recursive homunculi should not be mistaken for Dennett supporting the concept that human minds work by a nested set of ever stupider little men, even though following that thought experiment to its conclusion gives us finally a homunculus with the identical capacity of the physical circuitry of a modern calculator's basic logic gate. The theory of mind that our brain is nothing but a fleshy calculating device is in 2015 an obsolete and disproved idea. Now, Cartesian theater is a term coined derisively by Dan Dennett to refer pointedly to a defining aspect of what he calls Cartesian materialism, which he considers, Dan Dennett does, the often unacknowledged remnants of Cartesian dualism based on the work of Descartes in current and modern theories of mind. Descartes originally claimed that consciousness requires an immaterial soul, which interacts with the body via the pineal gland of the brain. Dennett says that when the dualism between immaterial and material is removed, what remains of Descartes' original model amounts to imagining a tiny theater in the brain where a homunculus, that is a small person, performs the task of observing all the sensory data projected onto a screen at a particular instant and then making decisions and sending out commands to control the body. Now, despite the use or the possible misuse by Pinker of Dennett's musings on the utility of a homunculus, Dan Dennett is not backing this idea up as a legitimate modern theory of mind. I'm sorry to Dr. Pinker and all his fans. Now, to other fans and supporters of Evo-Psych, it might seem like a good argumentative approach to say that the theory of mind as a set of prehistorically evolved domain-specific modules is not what current best practice Evo-Psych claims. Thus, they may argue that a module overseer, a cognitive traffic cop, or a tiny homunculus selecting which modules to activate based on sensory input is not the absurd theory by which Evo-Psych earns its place in the trash bin of bad ideas. Now, if that's what you think, I'm going to read you the following. This is the abstract of a paper called The Theory of Mind Module in Evolutionary Psychology by Professor Philip Gerrans at the Department of Philosophy, Adelaide University, South Australia. The paper begins as follows, quote, Evolutionary psychology is based on the idea that the mind is a set of special-purpose thinking devices or modules whose domain-specific structure is an adaptation to ancestral environments. Another title called Evolution and Human Mind, Modularity, Language, and Metacognition, published online in 2009 by Richard Samuels, states in its introduction, quote, In recent years, evolutionary psychologists have defended a massively modular conception of cognitive architecture which views the mind as composed largely, or perhaps even entirely, of innate special-purpose computational mechanisms or modules. So we return to my first question. Is evolutionary psychology, as it is presently conceived, a serious and empirical scientific discipline? Is it a scientific field respected by other scientists? Or is it a very new field of mostly open speculation, mostly unconnected to testing against evidence, with a very long road to go before it can be reasonably called a legitimate science? Worse than that, has it already been substantially replaced with more empirically based fields of study? Connectionism, conceptual dependence theory, and case-based reasoning are all areas of growth in modern theory of mind, displacing Evo-Psych as useful and testable models. But exploring those theories is beyond the scope of this video. But we have still not addressed the second question I opened this video up with. As it is used by armchair theorizers, is Evo-Psych anything more than a confirmation bias propping up of pseudo-science? Or are the critics and the rejectors of this excellent and empirically rigorous field simply in denial, like modern religious fundamentalist Luddites, arguing against Darwinian natural selection? Well, the characterization, in denial, suggests, of course, that what's being denied is an accepted and established scientific discipline. And if it turns out that the field in debate is hotly controversial among scientists themselves, and for very good reasons, as we've seen, then the characterization, in denial, is assuming the credibility of a field yet to be established. This is the classic formal logical fallacy of begging the question. This is obviously only the most cursory introduction to this topic, which I will be exploring in more depth in upcoming videos, but that's all for now. So, to everybody who sat through this whole thing, thank you all very much for listening, and as always, have a lovely day.